Most people walk through life convinced they're making their own choices. They believe their desires are their own, their reactions are natural, and their decisions arise from some inner compass. The truth is far more uncomfortable. Your mind is a machine with levers, and someone right now is pulling them. Someone who understands how fear works, how ego reacts, how attention collapses, and how pressure shapes behavior. Most people never see the hand behind the curtain because they aren't trained to look for it. They think control requires force, loudness, or domination. It doesn't. Real control is quiet, precision-based, surgical. It manipulates the environment, not the target. It rearranges incentives, not emotions. It bends perception until the person being controlled genuinely believes the choice was theirs. If you understand these mechanisms, you stop being a pawn in someone else's game. You begin to see how leaders, manipulators, governments, institutions, parents, lovers, and competitors shape the world through invisible psychological architecture. This audiobook is not about cheap tricks or superficial power hacks. It is an anatomical breakdown of control, its skeleton, its muscles, its bloodstream. Once you see it, you'll never unsee it again. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Human Vulnerability. Control always begins with understanding what people fear, crave, deny, and hide from themselves. If you misunderstand this, every tactic falls apart. People aren't controlled through force. They're controlled through their own psychological wiring. And whether they admit it or not, every human being, yes, even the confident, the intelligent, the accomplished, has cracks in the architecture of their mind. These cracks aren't weaknesses in the dramatic sense. They're simply the structural truths of human psychology. Start with the basics. The desire to belong. This is not a shallow preference. It is one of the deepest survival instincts encoded into the human brain. For most of human history, being excluded meant death. Today, exclusion might look like social isolation, losing a job, being ignored, or being seen as irrelevant, but the emotional reaction is the same. People want to feel part of a tribe. They want acknowledgement, acceptance, and a sense of position within social hierarchies. When someone feels they might lose belonging, they become malleable. They compromise, soften their stance, or align themselves with whoever provides that sense of inclusion. Then comes the fear of rejection. This fear governs more decisions than people realize. It controls who they date, how they speak, what risks they take, and what truths they hide. Rejection is not just someone saying no to them. It is a threat to identity. People will alter their behavior drastically to avoid it. They will stay in relationships they outgrew, follow leaders they don't fully trust, and tolerate behaviors that harm them all because the possibility of rejection feels worse than the reality of discomfort. If you understand how someone reacts to rejection, you gain insight into their boundaries and how easily those boundaries collapse under pressure. Every individual also carries a need for validation. This isn't vanity. It's a craving tied to the human reward system. When someone feels seen, admired, or respected, their brain gives them a chemical reward. And once people get used to that reward, they will work to keep it coming. This is why compliments, attention, approval, and recognition can shape behavior more effectively than criticism ever will. People may claim they don't care what others think, but their behavior exposes the truth. Their tone shifts when they feel admired. Their confidence rises when they feel validated. Their defensiveness spikes when validation is missing. If someone needs external validation, you already know where the puppet strings are attached. Next is the avoidance of uncertainty. Humans consistently prefer predictable suffering over unpredictable possibility. The unknown terrifies people because it threatens their sense of stability. They want clear expectations, clear outcomes, and clear rules, even if those rules are unfair. When faced with uncertainty, they gravitate toward anyone who presents clarity, even if that clarity is just confidence without substance. A Machiavellian strategist understands this instinct and uses it by positioning themselves as the source of certainty. The person who reduces uncertainty becomes the person others follow. Authority bias is another deeply ingrained vulnerability. People instinctively lean toward those who appear authoritative, not necessarily those who are right, but those who look and sound like they know what they're doing. Posture, tone, decisiveness, and self-command trigger this instinct. The appearance of authority often overrides logic. This is why calm, Collected individuals are rarely challenged. People default to trusting them. They interpret confidence as competence. It's predictable, and predictability is exploitable. The longing for significance is equally powerful. Every person wants to feel like they matter, even if they don't admit it. They want to feel chosen, respected, admired, irreplaceable, or at least necessary. When someone feels insignificant, they become restless, insecure, reactive, or easily influenced. When someone feels deeply significant, seen, valued, or important, they become loyal, consistent, and accommodating. Understanding what makes someone feel significant is the blueprint for influencing them. These vulnerabilities don't announce themselves. People rarely say, "I feel insecure," or "I need validation." Instead, vulnerabilities leak through behavior, tiny, almost invisible cues. The momentary hesitation before answering a question, the shift in posture when a certain person enters the room, the urge to over-explain, the way someone reacts to silence, the immediate defensiveness that appears when a sensitive topic is mentioned, the subtle eagerness when their opinion is valued, the discomfort when someone sets a boundary they didn't expect. These micro-reactions reveal the structure of a person's internal architecture more clearly than their words ever will. Machiavellian control doesn't attack these vulnerabilities. Attack creates resistance. Attack exposes intention. Attack breaks the illusion of influence. The objective is not confrontation. It is understanding. You map the vulnerabilities, not weaponize them recklessly. You observe how someone responds to praise, how they react to disagreement, how they behave when they're unsure, how they handle being ignored, how they try to impress, how they hide discomfort, and how they mask insecurity. Every reaction is data. Once you understand someone's insecurity, you understand where their decisions originate. A person insecure about abandonment will cling. A person insecure about not being enough will overcompensate. A person insecure about status will compete unnecessarily. A person insecure about intelligence will over-explain or shut down. These patterns are consistent and predictable. And once behavior becomes predictable, it becomes influenceable. Understanding someone's ego uncovers their blind spot. Ego is the part of the mind that craves a certain identity. Smart, kind, strong, moral, powerful, independent, admirable. When you understand what identity someone wants others to see, you understand what they will work to protect. If you can see someone's ego, you know exactly where they're vulnerable to flattery, criticism, comparison, admiration, or subtle narrative shifts. Control is rarely about overpowering someone. Overpowering requires constant energy and creates resistance. True control is about guiding a person's vulnerabilities in the direction you want. You don't push them. You align with the gravitational pull already inside them. You don't force their behavior. You position your influence where their psychology naturally leans. You make the path you want them to take feel like the most natural path available. People think they act from reason. They act from vulnerability. Once you grasp that, the mechanics of control become obvious. Most people never see it because they are too busy managing their own insecurities to notice when someone else is quietly reading them. The ones who do see it hold an advantage that appears like intuition or charisma, but it is none of that. It is simply understanding human architecture at its most fundamental level. And once you see these structures, you stop being controlled by them and start understanding how easily they shape everyone else. Chapter 2. Perception is power. Power does not belong to the person who is right. It belongs to the person who controls the interpretation of reality. Most people assume they see the world objectively, but human beings do not respond to facts. They respond to meaning, and meaning is manufactured. Whoever defines the meaning of a situation controls how everyone else behaves within it. That is the core of perception-based power. You control the story, and the story controls the people. Perception shapes everything you think is true. Your view of yourself, your relationships, your role in society, your limits, your future. These are not built from facts, but from interpretations. When someone says a leader is strong, what they really mean is the leader appears strong. When someone says a person is trustworthy, what they actually mean is the person appears trustworthy. A reputation is nothing more than a perception repeated enough times that people mistake it for reality. This is why Machiavellian thinkers operate from a simple principle. The world runs on appearances, not accuracy. Most people waste their time trying to be right, trying to correct others, or trying to prove facts. Powerful people invest their time shaping perceptions, because perception dictates belief, and belief dictates action. To control perception, you start by understanding that most people are not actively thinking. They are scanning for emotional cues, social signals, and confidence markers. When someone speaks with certainty, people instinctively trust them. When someone appears calm under pressure, people follow them. When someone behaves like they belong at the top, others unconsciously accept their position. Confidence is not a reflection of truth. It is a delivery system for influence. People remember tone before they remember logic. They remember emotion before they remember details. They remember how someone made them feel before they remember what someone actually said. This is why perception power is so effective. It bypasses rational analysis and embeds itself directly in the emotional brain. If you can manage the emotional reaction you create, you can manage the conclusions people draw about you. A Machiavellian strategist knows that controlling perception does not require lying or manipulation. It requires framing. A frame is the mental box that determines how something is interpreted. You can tell the truth and still shape perception entirely by framing that truth strategically. Two people can experience the same event, but if one person frames it first, they control how the second person makes sense of it. The first interpretation wins because it becomes the reference point the mind defaults to. This is why people who move slowly, speak deliberately, and maintain composure appear powerful. They create a perception of certainty, and others adopt that perception as truth. People subconsciously assume that anyone who is not rattled must understand something they don't. Calmness becomes a signal of competence. Steadiness becomes a signal of authority. Stillness becomes a signal of control. People gravitate toward the person who can maintain their center when everyone else is losing theirs. Perception also thrives in ambiguity. When a situation is unclear, the person who defines it first becomes the anchor everyone else attaches to. In moments of confusion, fear, or conflict, people cling to the simplest explanation offered with the greatest conviction. This is the reason leaders, influencers, and manipulators step in quickly to define what something means. Once people accept your version of meaning, they will defend it as if they came up with it themselves. They will argue for it, justify it, and reinforce it, giving you power without requiring your direct involvement. Another component of perception power is controlling how others see your intentions. People are more influenced by what they believe you want than what you actually want. If your intentions appear aligned with their desires, they trust you. If your intentions appear neutral, they respect you. If your intentions appear unpredictable, they fear you. The key is crafting an image that serves your objectives without revealing your internal strategy. You want people to see you as confident but not arrogant, decisive but not reckless, knowledgeable but not rigid, independent but not disconnected. People follow the individual who seems both strong and stable, assertive and controlled. Perception is also shaped through scarcity and accessibility. When you are always available, people perceive you as less valuable. When you are selective, people perceive you as higher status. Humans instinctively assign value to what is less common. This applies to time, attention, resources, and presence. The less you give, the more people perceive you as someone who must be sought after. The more you give, the more people perceive you as someone who must seek approval. Scarcity is not manipulation. It is a psychological truth. Another pillar of perception power is association. People evaluate you based on the people you surround yourself with, the environment you appear in, and the standards you project. A person who associates with chaos looks chaotic. A person who associates with discipline looks disciplined. Appearances bleed into identity. This is why Machiavelli advised rulers to avoid being seen with fools or unstable people. The mind automatically thinks, if you tolerate instability, you must be unstable yourself. Perception builds from patterns, not facts. But perhaps the most overlooked aspect of perception is self-perception. People treat you according to how you treat yourself. If you communicate that your time is valuable, others adjust their behavior. If you communicate that you expect fairness, people hesitate to violate your boundaries. If you communicate that you believe you belong in a position of influence, others accept that belief faster than you think. Your internal narrative becomes an external signal. and the world responds to those signals. Perception power is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is not forceful. It is subtle, intentional, and composed. You cannot fake it with theatrics or exaggerated behavior. True perception power is built through consistency, speaking with conviction, behaving with discipline, maintaining emotional steadiness, and shaping meaning before others get the chance to define it. Once you understand that the world reacts to perception, not truth, you stop wasting energy trying to convince people. You learn to craft the frame instead. You learn to decide the meaning instead. You learn to influence reactions by controlling interpretations. And eventually, you realize something crucial. The most powerful person in any room is the one whose reality everyone else quietly accepts. That is the essence of perception as power. Control the story, and you control the people who believe it. Chapter 3. The Lever of Emotional Asymmetry. Power shifts the moment one person feels more than the other. Emotions are not just reactions, they are leverage points. The individual who is calmer, steadier, and less invested always holds the upper hand over the one who is anxious, eager, or afraid to lose something. This imbalance, emotional asymmetry, is one of the most predictable and exploitable mechanisms in human psychology. People like to imagine they make decisions rationally, but in reality, emotions do the driving while logic simply justifies the destination. When someone's emotions spike, their reasoning capacity collapses, their attention narrows, their judgment blurs, and their desire for relief overrides their long-term thinking. This is the moment where control becomes easy. When someone cares too much, they give up power without realizing it. Emotional asymmetry is not about detachment or coldness. It's about controlling your inner world so thoroughly that external forces barely disrupt you. When you are emotionally steady, people instinctively lean toward you because you offer something they subconsciously crave: stability. Humans are wired to seek equilibrium. When they feel unstable, they cling to whoever seems grounded. That person becomes the emotional anchor in the room, and the anchor controls the current. The truth is simple. The person who needs the outcome the least has the most influence over it. In relationships, negotiations, arguments, alliances, and even subtle social interactions, the dynamic shifts based on who is more affected. If one person remains calm while the other spirals into frustration or impatience, the calm one instantly rises in status. They become the reference point. They become the one who sets the pace, the tone, and the direction. This is why emotionally reactive people are easy to manipulate. Their reactions give away their vulnerabilities. Their emotional spikes reveal what they value, what they fear, and what they're desperately trying to protect. Someone who cannot control their emotions cannot control how others perceive them. And perception is the architecture of power. When you let your emotions dictate your behavior, you hand control to whoever can trigger you. A Machiavellian strategist does not seek to eliminate emotions. That's impossible and unnecessary. Instead, they aim to understand emotions so deeply that they are never hijacked by them. They use emotions as information. If someone becomes defensive, they're protecting something. If someone becomes excited, they want something. If someone becomes anxious, they fear losing something. Each emotional shift acts like a flashing indicator on the psychological dashboard. But emotional asymmetry is not just about staying calm. It's about creating contrast. If you remain steady while someone else becomes emotional, your steadiness is amplified. You look more disciplined, more competent, more authoritative, even if you're not objectively smarter or stronger. The human mind equates emotional self-control with power, because historically, the people who could stay composed under stress were the ones who made life and death decisions. That association still shapes human instincts today. This is why the most powerful people rarely show urgency. Urgency signals desperation. Desperation signals dependence. Dependence signals weakness. When you rush, you communicate that the situation controls you. When you slow down, you communicate that you control the situation. A delayed response, a measured breath, a thoughtful pause, these are not small gestures. They are signals that you are not emotionally overwhelmed. People instinctively trust those who do not panic. Emotional asymmetry also plays out in subtle social rhythms. When someone insults you and you stay calm, you do more than look mature. You reveal that their words cannot destabilize you. This immediately puts them on the back foot. because their attack failed to achieve its purpose. When someone tries to provoke you and you respond with composure, you signal that you are not playing their game, you are watching it, and the observer always has more power than the participant. This principle applies equally in persuasion. People follow those who seem less emotionally needy. A message delivered with emotional restraint is perceived as more credible. A request framed without urgency is seen as more valuable. A person who does not beg for agreement appears more confident in their position. People want to align with certainty, not desperation. Emotional asymmetry is also a strategic filter. When you stay calm, other people reveal themselves more clearly. They talk more, expose more, confess more. They rush in to fill the silence you leave. They make decisions to relieve their own discomfort, not to strengthen their position. Meanwhile, you collect information, analyze patterns, and position yourself advantageously while appearing completely neutral. A powerful part of emotional asymmetry is the ability to make others adjust to you. When you remain steady, people begin matching your emotional tone. They mirror your calmness, your pacing, your energy. This mirroring is not conscious. It is a natural psychological response because humans are wired to sync their emotions with whoever seems most stable. The moment people adjust to you emotionally, they start adjusting to you mentally. Influence begins. But emotional asymmetry is not about pretending. Pretense cracks under pressure. It is about internal discipline. You can fake confidence, but you cannot fake emotional stability, not consistently. True stability comes from understanding your triggers, your insecurities, your impulses, and your patterns. It comes from refusing to hand your internal state to external forces. You cannot control others if you cannot control yourself. The paradox is this: the less emotional chaos you allow into your mind, the more emotional chaos others will reveal in your presence. They will show their fears, their ego wounds, their anxieties, their desires, all the leverage points needed to understand them. While they unravel, you remain intact. While they react, you observe. While they seek relief, you maintain clarity. And clarity is the ultimate form of power in any emotional exchange. Emotional asymmetry is not about being heartless. It is about being untouchable. The moment your emotions stop dictating your behavior, you stop being controlled by people who know how to trigger you. When you no longer fear loss, you cannot be manipulated through scarcity. When you no longer cling to validation, you cannot be controlled through approval. When you no longer react impulsively, you cannot be provoked into mistakes. The individual with emotional discipline becomes the gravitational center in every interaction. They don't chase, they don't panic, they don't crumble, and because of that, people orbit around them. That is the quiet, invisible, undeniable power of emotional asymmetry. Chapter 4: Strategic Silence and the Power of Restraint. People think power expresses itself through action, through volume, force, intensity, or constant movement. But in human psychology, influence often emerges in the empty spaces. Silence, restraint, and deliberate non-reaction create pressure in ways that loudness never can. Humans are wired to fear the unknown, and silence is the purest form of the unknown. It leaves room for imagination, insecurity, and projection. The mind rushes to fill the vacuum, and because people tend to fill uncertainty with their own fears, silence becomes a mirror that exposes them more than it protects them. Strategic silence is not avoidance. It is not passivity. It is a controlled absence that forces others to reveal themselves. People show you who they are when you stop giving them cues to respond to. When someone tries to provoke a reaction, they are attempting to control the emotional rhythm of the exchange. If you refuse to take the bait, they lose their script. Their energy has nowhere to go. They spiral, stumble, or over-explain because silence steals the stability they rely on. Consider how people behave in conversations. Most individuals cannot tolerate even a few seconds of silence. They feel compelled to fill the gap, to clarify, to justify, to soften, to explain. This compulsion is rooted in discomfort. Silence makes them feel exposed. When there is no immediate feedback, they begin questioning their words, their tone, or their standing in the interaction. They search for reassurance. They try to read your mind. They start adjusting their behavior based on imaginary conclusions. In that moment, their psychological balance tilts in your direction. Because you are no longer reacting to them, they are reacting to you. Restraint amplifies this effect. When you do not rush to respond, you signal that you do not operate on emotional impulse. Your pace becomes the dominant rhythm. People naturally synchronize with the emotional tone that seems more stable, and the person exercising restraint always appears more stable than the one who reacts instantly. This is why silence often feels like authority. It communicates control, not just of the situation, but of oneself. And self-control reads as power. There is a reason leaders who speak slowly and pause intentionally seem more commanding. Their silence communicates confidence. It sends a message. I am not pressured by this moment. I'm evaluating, not reacting. Humans instinctively view evaluation as strength and reactivity as weakness. Even in neutral situations, the slower, more controlled communicator gains psychological ground because their behavior implies internal certainty. This dynamic becomes even more pronounced in conflict. When someone raises their voice and you do not respond in kind, the contrast exposes the instability of their emotional state. Your restraint disrupts their rhythm, forcing them to confront their own escalation. They begin to question whether their intensity is justified. They may even feel embarrassed or self-conscious. Their emotional spike collapses under the weight of your stillness. This is not about winning arguments. It is about maintaining clarity when others lose theirs. Silence gives you time to see the full landscape, the motivations, the fears, the hidden angles. People reveal far more through their unfiltered reactions than through their crafted statements. When you give someone space to talk without interruption, they eventually say the things they were trying not to say. They confess more, expose more, and contradict themselves more. Restraint turns every conversation into a psychological X-ray. Strategic silence also dismantles false dominance. Some individuals use noise, volume, or constant talking to project superiority. But projection requires feedback. When you don't respond to their display, their performance loses oxygen. Their presence no longer overwhelms because it is no longer being acknowledged. Silence deflates theatrics. It strips away the illusion of power and forces the person to confront the reality underneath their bravado. Restraint also controls pace. People who want control often try to rush you into decisions, explanations, or emotional reactions. They want you off balance. They want to seize momentum and force you into responding before you've had time to think. The moment you slow down, you break the spell. Rushing is a tactic of insecurity. Slowness is a byproduct of confidence. The person who controls the tempo controls the interaction. Silence is equally powerful in persuasion. When you present an idea and then stop talking, the silence becomes a space where the other person begins processing. If they're unsure, they fill the silence with questions revealing their thought process. If they're uncomfortable, they may talk themselves into your position just to end the tension. If they're resistant, they may still soften simply because your composure forces them to reevaluate their stance. But the most overlooked function of silence is how it shapes reputation. A person known for restraint gains an aura of mystery. People speculate about your thoughts, intentions, and interpretations. They assume you know more than you reveal. They may even assign depth or intelligence to you simply because you are not constantly broadcasting your internal state. Humans equate mystery with power because clarity makes you predictable, and predictability makes you easy to position. When people cannot easily read you, they give you more space, more respect, and more mental weight. However, silence must be intentional, not habitual. Habitual silence makes you invisible. Strategic silence makes you significant. The difference lies in whether your presence is felt even when you aren't speaking. That presence comes from restraint paired with confidence, not silence paired with fear. Restraint is also a discipline of ego. People speak impulsively when their ego feels threatened. They defend themselves prematurely. They argue too quickly. They explain too much. Silence bypasses ego. It says, I am not controlled by your assumptions. It allows false accusations to expose themselves without you having to lift a finger. It turns confrontation into observation. But the deepest power of silence is the psychological contrast it creates. When you rarely speak impulsively, your words carry more weight when you finally choose to speak. People listen more carefully. They interpret your statements more seriously. They attach meaning to your tone, your pauses, your emphasis. Silence makes your speech valuable because value increases with scarcity. In a world full of noise, the one who knows how to hold silence commands the room. Restraint is not the absence of action. It is action delivered precisely, sparingly, and at the right moment. It is not coldness, it is control. It is not distance, it is discipline. And in the architecture of power, restraint is one of the few tools that works even when you do nothing at all. That is the paradox of strategic silence. The less you exert, the more others reveal. The quieter you become, the louder their insecurities echo. The more you hold back, the more people lean forward. And the moment they lean forward, the balance of power has already shifted. Chapter 5. The Art of Predictable Rewards and Timed Withdrawals. Human behavior is shaped by patterns. People think they act from logic, but in reality, they respond to rhythms, the emotional patterns that govern their expectations, their confidence, and their sense of security. One of the most powerful rhythms in human psychology is the cycle of reward and withdrawal, not as a tactic to control others, but as a lens to understand how relationships, hierarchies, loyalty, and influence naturally evolve. To understand this pattern, you must start with a basic truth about the human brain. It is wired to seek pleasure and avoid discomfort, not in a shallow sense, but at a biological level. Predictable rewards create comfort, safety, and trust. Unpredictable rewards create intensity, attachment, and fixation. Withdrawals, when they occur without hostility, trigger reflection, recalibration, and heightened attention. These patterns exist everywhere in friendships, work dynamics, romantic relationships, leadership structures, social groups, and even self-discipline. Predictable rewards form the foundation of stability. When someone consistently treats you well, responds thoughtfully, or behaves with reliability, their presence becomes emotionally safe. You come to expect their steadiness. This predictability builds trust because the brain relaxes around consistent patterns. Predictable rewards are the soil in which loyalty grows. When people know what to expect from you, they orient themselves around you. Your presence becomes a reference point, steady, grounded, and dependable. But here is the deeper truth. Predictable rewards create comfort, but comfort alone does not create long-term influence. Comfort is warm, but it can become dull. Stability is valuable, but the human mind adapts to stability quickly. What was once meaningful becomes normal. What was once appreciated becomes expected. The brain stops noticing what is always available. This is why consistency without variation often goes unnoticed, even when it is deeply valuable. Then comes the second force in the rhythm, withdrawal. Withdrawal does not mean punishment. It does not mean coldness, hostility, or emotional distance. It simply means a shift, a reduction in presence, attention, affirmation, or energy. When a pattern of predictable reward is interrupted, even slightly, the brain pays attention again. The shift wakes it up. It triggers curiosity, reflection, and awareness. People start asking themselves why the rhythm changed. They analyze their own behavior. They revisit the value of what they previously took for granted. Withdrawal amplifies awareness. It reveals what the reward truly meant. When someone who is normally warm becomes slightly quieter, their warmth suddenly becomes magnified in memory. When a leader who is usually available takes a step back, their presence becomes significant again. When a friend who is always supportive goes silent for a moment, their support becomes more meaningful. Withdrawal forces the mind to look at the pattern instead of simply riding it. This isn't manipulation, this is the natural way human attention works. The mind cannot maintain constant appreciation. It appreciates in contrast. Contrast is what heightens value. This is why intermittent patterns are so emotionally powerful. People become more attentive, more reflective, and more aware when the rhythm they rely on shifts. Just like waves, the rise and fall of presence creates psychological movement. A world with no contrast becomes stagnant. But contrast doesn't mean chaos. Chaos destroys trust. Erratic behavior breaks emotional safety. Unpredictability without foundation leads to confusion, anxiety, and distance. The power of this pattern comes from two things working together: a stable foundation and subtle variation. A foundation without variation is invisible. Variation without foundation is unstable. But variation anchored in steadiness creates emotional depth. The mind becomes more alive, more attentive, and more engaged. This dynamic also reveals something essential about influence. People value what they must engage with consciously. Predictable rewards are unconscious. You enjoy them automatically. But when the rhythm shifts, you must become aware of what you are receiving. Awareness deepens value. This is why leaders who balance approachability with measured distance create stronger followings. If they are always present, their presence becomes ordinary. If they are always distant, their presence becomes meaningless. But when they show up with intention, with clarity, with purpose, and then step back, their presence becomes symbolic. It's the difference between noise and signal. Another dimension of this rhythm is reflection. When someone withdraws slightly, it gives the other person space to process their own thoughts without pressure. In that space, clarity emerges. People realize what matters. They assess their own behavior. They understand the relationship more clearly. They see where they may have been taking things for granted. Reflection cannot occur in constant emotional saturation. Withdrawal creates the mental oxygen needed for reflection. But the most important truth about this pattern is that it applies inward before it applies outward. If you want to understand the psychology of reward and withdrawal, you must first observe it within yourself. Notice how your motivation spikes when you give yourself a break after discipline. Notice how your appreciation for something deepens when you fast from it for a short time, whether it's technology, entertainment, comfort, or social validation. Notice how your energy increases when you intentionally balance effort with rest. Reward and withdrawal shape the internal world long before they shape the interpersonal world. Self-discipline, for example, is built through strategic cycles, pushing and resting, effort and recovery. If you push yourself relentlessly, you burn out. If you rest constantly, you decay. The internal architecture of progress mirrors the emotional architecture of influence, stability, variation, reflection, awareness. Understanding this rhythm allows you to see human behavior for what it is, not random, not chaotic, but patterned. People attach to what feels meaningful. Meaning grows through contrast. Loyalty grows through stability. Appreciation grows through reflection. Influence grows through presence applied with intention, not excess. The point is not to manipulate anyone. The point is to understand why relationships deepen, why loyalty stabilizes, why connection intensifies, and why certain dynamics feel powerful while others fade into the background. It is to understand why the human mind reacts differently to consistency, contrast, attention, absence, effort, and retreat. When you understand these patterns, you stop misreading people. You stop misreading yourself, and you begin to see how emotional rhythms shape the architecture of every connection in your life. This is the psychological truth behind reward and withdrawal, not as a tactic, but as a universal pattern woven into human behavior. Chapter 6. Manipulating the frame. Human beings do not respond to reality. They respond to the frame placed around reality. A frame is the mental structure that tells someone how to interpret a situation. It's the invisible border that decides what something means, what options seem available, and what emotional response feels justified. Most people think they form their own interpretations, but in truth, they adopt the first frame they hear, the loudest frame in the room, or the frame that makes them feel safest. Frames are powerful because the human mind hates ambiguity. When something happens, the mind immediately asks, "What does this mean?" Whoever answers that question first becomes the invisible author of the narrative, not through force, but through structure. If you define the meaning of a moment, you shape the emotional reaction to it. And once the emotional reaction is shaped, the thoughts and behaviors follow automatically. This is why strong frames quietly dominate weak ones. A weak frame is reactive, defensive, uncertain, or overly literal. A strong frame is calm, narrative-driven, and rooted in certainty. People instinctively lean toward the frame that feels more stable because stability feels safe. A frame is not a statement or an argument. It is the context that makes the statement or argument make sense. If someone says, "This is a crisis," that is not just a description. It is a frame. If someone says, "This is an opportunity," that is also a frame. Same situation, two realities, two entirely different emotional responses. Humans don't follow truth. They follow the frame that makes them feel oriented. A Machiavellian lens doesn't force interpretations onto people. It recognizes how quickly people adopt interpretations that are delivered confidently, calmly, and early. Most misunderstandings, conflicts, and power struggles are simply frame battles. One person trying to define the meaning of something, while the other person clings to theirs. This becomes obvious in everyday dynamics. When someone criticizes you harshly, if you react defensively, you accept their frame. You are the accused, and they are the judge. If you reply slowly and calmly, you subtly shift the frame to, "I am not threatened," and your judgment has no authority here. Same words exchanged, different frame, different power dynamic. Frames operate through tone, pacing, posture, timing, and emotional steadiness, far more than through logic. A weak frame tries to fight with facts. A strong frame simply defines the reality and lets others adjust to it. The real secret behind frames is that humans crave coherence more than accuracy. They would rather adopt a simple, stable frame that gives them emotional clarity than deal with a confusing one that might be more true. This is why even flawed narratives, once accepted, become ridiculously hard to break. The mind defends the frame because the frame provides structure. When you understand how frames work, you begin to see how often people misinterpret behavior. For example, silence can be framed as disinterest or framed as careful consideration. A mistake can be framed as incompetence or framed as a calculated risk. A delay can be framed as disrespect or framed as high standards. The frame determines the emotional response, not the action itself. Most conflicts arise not from behavior, but from mismatched frames. One person frames something as urgent, the other frames it as trivial. One frames directness as disrespect, the other frames it as honesty. One frames silence as distance, the other frames it as calm. The fight is not about the situation, it is about the meaning attached to it. Understanding frames also shows why people follow leaders so naturally. Leadership is, at its core, the ability to provide a frame others willingly adopt. If a leader says, "We're entering a difficult period, but we're prepared," the frame is stability. If a leader says, "Everything is falling apart," the frame is chaos. The same external reality feels different depending on who frames it. Frames also reveal something crucial about influence. The person who reacts last wins. Reaction is frame acceptance. If you respond instantly, emotionally, or impulsively, you signal that the other person's frame has pulled you in. If you pause, think, or maintain composure, you signal that you are examining the situation from a frame of your choosing. People respect the mind that does not get dragged into the emotional gravity of others. Frames don't require dominance. They require clarity. A Machiavellian analysis doesn't say, "Impose your frame," because imposing creates resistance. Instead, it recognizes that the strongest frame is the one that feels most natural, most coherent, and most emotionally stable. People will gravitate toward the interpretation that reduces their uncertainty. If your frame offers groundedness, explanation, and structure, most individuals will adopt it simply because it makes their internal world easier to manage. A strong frame is not rigid either. Rigidity shatters under pressure. A powerful frame adapts. It acknowledges facts without surrendering the core interpretation. For example, someone with a fragile ego reacts to challenges by collapsing or attacking. Someone with a strong frame incorporates the challenge into their narrative without losing balance. Flexibility within stability is the hallmark of a dominant psychological presence. Another dimension of frames is ownership. People behave differently when they believe an idea is theirs versus when they feel it's being imposed on them. The most effective frames are the ones people feel they discovered themselves. A good leader or communicator doesn't say, "Here's the correct interpretation." They reveal the pieces in such a way that others arrive at the interpretation naturally. When meaning feels self-generated, people defend it with conviction. This is why you cannot bully someone into accepting your reality. If the frame doesn't match their internal need for coherence, they will reject it instantly. But if the frame fits the emotional puzzle they're already trying to solve, it becomes irresistible. Frames also shape self-identity. The story someone tells themselves about who they are is a frame. It determines what they believe they deserve, what risks they avoid, what opportunities they pursue, and how they interpret setbacks. Change the frame someone uses for themselves, and everything around that identity reorganizes. But the highest level of frame awareness is not external, it is internal. Most people operate inside frames they never chose. Cultural frames, family frames, fear-based frames, ego-preserving frames, frames inherited from past experiences. They react to life through these unconscious interpretations and never question them. Someone who understands frames learns to see their own biases, insecurities, and emotional defaults more clearly. And once you understand the frames running you, you stop being owned by them. You begin to interpret situations more consciously. You choose meaning instead of absorbing it. You respond on your terms. You adjust without losing your center. And you stop being dragged into the emotional worlds of others. That is where real psychological power begins, not in bending others, but in refusing to be bent by every frame that tries to pull you in. When you master your internal framing, external frames lose their grip, and the person who cannot be absorbed into someone else's reality becomes the person others quietly revolve around. That is the deeper essence of framing, not control of others, but control of meaning itself. Chapter 7. The final law: control yourself or control nothing. Every strategy, every psychological insight, every structure of influence collapses if you cannot govern the one force that determines all your decisions. Yourself. Emotional discipline, mental steadiness, and self-command are not accessories to power. They are the core architecture. Without them, even the most brilliant mind becomes its own worst enemy. People spend their lives trying to manage situations, circumstances, crises, and other people. They try to push, pull, adjust, explain, convince, correct, react, and counter-react. It never ends because the battle they are fighting is external. The individual who shifts their attention inward, mastering their impulses, their thinking patterns, their fears, and their reactions, stops battling the world and begins shaping it instead. Self-control isn't glamorous. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like silence when others expect noise. It looks like patience when others expect urgency. It looks like clarity when others expect confusion. It looks like boundaries when others expect availability. It looks like steadiness when others expect collapse. People misinterpret these qualities as stoicism or detachment, but they are simply the marks of someone who has stopped outsourcing their stability to external events. The truth is harsh but simple. If your emotions can be destabilized easily, you are not in control. If your mood depends on the behavior of others, you are not in control. If your confidence disappears the moment someone disapproves of you, you are not in control. If you react impulsively when something threatens your ego, you are not in control. And if you cannot tolerate discomfort without needing immediate relief, your decisions will always be compromised. The strongest individuals in history were not strong because they dominated others. They were strong because they dominated themselves. Their internal world was structured, disciplined, and anchored. They understood their own patterns, their own triggers, their own narratives, and their own blind spots. This self-knowledge gave them a clarity that appeared almost superhuman. When others panicked, they stayed grounded. When others overreacted, they assessed. When others sought validation, they stayed aligned with their principles. Self-control begins with understanding your internal friction points. These are the parts of you that shake under pressure. Your fear of failure, your fear of being judged, your fear of not being enough, your fear of uncertainty, your fear of confrontation, your fear of losing approval. These fears create distortions. They make you overcompensate, avoid, delay, surrender, or react emotionally instead of intelligently. If you do not address these internal frictions, no amount of external strategy will compensate. You will sabotage your own progress. You will chase short-term comfort instead of long-term clarity. You will react from wounds instead of wisdom. And you will attribute your chaos to external causes, never realizing the battlefield is inside. Self-control is not suppression, it is understanding. Suppression hides emotions. Understanding dissolves them. When you feel threatened by someone's opinion, suppression would tell you to stay calm. Understanding asks, why do I need that person's approval in the first place? What identity am I trying to protect? When you feel defensive, suppression says, don't react. Understanding asks, what part of me feels exposed? Why does this bother me? When you feel anxious, suppression tells you to breathe and move on. Understanding asks, what story am I telling myself about this situation that creates this anxiety? Self-control grows by dismantling the internal illusions that keep you reactive. A person who understands their insecurities becomes immune to attacks that target them. A person who understands their motivations becomes immune to temptations that mislead them. A person who understands their triggers becomes immune to people who try to provoke them. The more self-aware you become, the fewer opportunities the world has to destabilize you. Internal power also requires emotional tolerance, the ability to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. People make their worst decisions when they cannot tolerate temporary discomfort. They chase quick validation, seek instant relief, or try to force control over things they don't understand. A person with emotional tolerance can sit inside uncertainty without panicking. They can feel fear without fleeing. They can feel frustration without exploding. They can feel doubt without collapsing. This tolerance becomes a form of silent superiority. Others operate like slaves to their impulses. You operate like the architect of your impulses. And because self-control is so rare, it commands an almost involuntary respect. People feel the difference. They sense the steadiness. They notice the absence of chaos. They may not understand what sets you apart, but they respond to it instinctively. Self-control also creates long-term perspective. Impulsive people live in the moment, but not in the mindful, enlightened sense. They live in the emotional moment, reacting to whatever sensation feels strongest. Their decisions are shaped by the emotion of the hour. A person with self-control sees beyond the moment. They see the long arc of consequences. They think in trajectories, not impulses. This long perspective makes them appear wise, even prophetic. In reality, they simply refuse to be hijacked by temporary emotions. The final level of self-control is narrative ownership. Every person carries an internal narrative that dictates what they believe they can do, what they deserve, how the world works, and what is possible. Most people never question this narrative. They inherited it from parents, culture, society, fear, or past trauma. They operate inside it unconsciously, never realizing the cage was built from assumptions rather than reality. Self-control requires rewriting this narrative consciously. It requires asking yourself what beliefs you carry that weaken you, what assumptions limit you, what fears distort your choices, what identities you cling to that no longer serve you. Internal mastery is impossible without internal editing. This is why self-control is not rigid. It is adaptable. It is not cold. It is conscious. It does not ignore emotion. It understands emotion so thoroughly that emotion becomes a signal, not a dictator. Once you reach this level of internal command, something profound happens. The external world loses its ability to dominate your internal state. People's opinions no longer define your self-concept. Pressure no longer distorts your decision-making. Fear no longer paralyzes you. Ego no longer blinds you. And reactions no longer control you. You become steady, not fragile, not brittle, not guarded. Simply steady. And steadiness is the rarest form of power. When you can command yourself, the world treats you differently. People mirror your stability. Situations feel less overwhelming. Decisions feel clearer. Conflicts feel less threatening. Uncertainty feels less chaotic. You begin shaping outcomes naturally, because you are no longer battling internal storms while trying to navigate external ones. This is the final law. Without inner governance, outer influence is an illusion. Without self-command, every strategy becomes unstable. Without internal mastery, external power becomes temporary at best. Master yourself and the world stops feeling like an adversary you must fight, and starts feeling like a landscape you can finally navigate with clarity, precision, and strength. That is the true foundation of all forms of power. Without it, nothing lasts. With it, everything aligns. Chapter 8. The Illusion of Power. Why most people misunderstand control. Most people spend their lives chasing the appearance of power instead of understanding the internal mechanics of it. They want dominance, influence, superiority, respect, obedience, validation, or status, but they never examine the psychological cost of chasing these things externally. They don't realize that power based on external conditions is not real power at all. It is dependency disguised as strength. The world is filled with people who appear powerful but are internally fragile. They have influence but cannot handle criticism. They have authority but collapse when they're ignored. They have status but are terrified of irrelevance. They have loud voices but quiet insecurities. They project confidence, but they react emotionally to small threats. They lead, but everything they do is driven by insecurity, ego, fear, or the need to stay on top. This is not power. This is instability wearing a mask. True power does not need to be proven. It does not need validation. It does not need constant reinforcement. It does not panic when challenged. It does not crumble under scrutiny. It does not chase approval. It does not depend on intimidation. Real power is internal, rooted in self-awareness, emotional control, psychological clarity, and the ability to remain grounded even when the ground around you shifts. The illusion of power comes from the outside. The reality of power comes from the inside. Most people misinterpret influence because they only notice its outward expressions. They see charisma, decisiveness, confidence, or assertiveness and assume that is where the power lies. But those are just reflections. They are the byproducts of something deeper, internal stability. Without internal stability, external expressions collapse quickly. The illusion of power thrives on performance. People perform strength the way actors perform roles convincingly at first, but inconsistently over time. They try to appear unshakable, but their behavior reveals fear. They try to appear superior, but their reactions expose insecurity. They try to appear dominant, but dominance built on fear collapses the moment fear loses its effect. This is why those who chase control over others often end up controlled by the very thing they depend on. The person who relies on praise becomes controlled by those who give or withhold it. The person who relies on attention becomes controlled by the audience. The person who relies on authority becomes controlled by the position that gives them that authority. The person who relies on ego becomes controlled by anything that threatens it. There is a painful paradox hiding inside this illusion. The more someone tries to control everything around them, the less control they have over themselves. This is why external power, without internal mastery, is unstable. The moment the environment changes, the illusion breaks. The moment someone challenges them, their confidence evaporates. The moment things don't go their way, their strength reveals itself to be emotional impulsiveness wrapped in a fancy package. Internal power works differently. It does not depend on circumstance. It does not depend on approval. It does not depend on dominance. It does not depend on performance. It depends on clarity. Clarity about who you are, clarity about what you want, clarity about what you fear, clarity about what triggers you, clarity about what your values are. Most people never develop this clarity because it requires discomfort confronting weaknesses instead of hiding them, facing insecurities instead of compensating for them, examining ego instead of feeding it. They run from internal work because it feels slow, quiet, and unglamorous. They choose the illusion because it offers faster gratification. But gratification is not power. It is the psychological sugar that distracts you from your own lack of discipline. True power requires the opposite of illusion. It requires transparency with yourself. It requires questioning your own assumptions, motives, emotional reactions, fears, and patterns. It requires understanding what part of you is acting, your confident self or your wounded self. It requires patience, restraint, and consistent self-examination. People misunderstand control because they equate it with winning. But winning and controlling are not the same. Winning is episodic, a moment of triumph. Control is continuous, the ability to influence outcomes without destabilizing yourself. Some people win an argument, but lose control of themselves in the process. Others lose publicly but maintain internal clarity and later position themselves far better. Control is not measured in victories. Control is measured in stability. Another layer of the illusion is that people assume power must be visible. They think influence requires recognition, but real influence is often quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not demand acknowledgement. It becomes visible only in outcomes in stability, in aligned decisions, in consistent behavior, and in relationships that are structured around mutual respect rather than fear. People who possess real internal power rarely chase external validation because they understand something most people don't. Validation is the reward for those who haven't yet developed self-certainty. When you know yourself deeply, other people's approval becomes optional. When you don't know yourself, other people's approval becomes oxygen. And that distinction separates internal power from the illusion of power more clearly than anything else. Another reason people misunderstand control is that they misread emotional expression. They assume calmness means apathy, restraint means weakness, and composure means lack of passion. In reality, composure is evidence of someone who does not let their emotions govern their actions. It is not emptiness, it is discipline. It is not coldness, it is clarity. It is not indifference, it is sovereignty over one's own internal state. People who cannot control themselves misinterpret calmness because they have never experienced it from the inside. The illusion of power relies on reaction. Real power relies on intention. One is unstable, the other is deliberate. One is dramatic, the other is consistent. One is performative, the other is grounded. One collapses in crisis, the other sharpens in crisis. This entire book has explored the psychological structures of influence, but they all point to the same conclusion. Power begins with self-mastery. Without it, every form of influence you gain is temporary and fragile. With it, every external dynamic becomes easier to navigate and less threatening. The final illusion to dissolve is this: you do not control others by overpowering them. You influence others by understanding yourself so deeply that your presence becomes stable, consistent, and grounded. People naturally gravitate toward the person who is least governed by chaos. Self-command is not a strategy, it is a state of being. It is built slowly, quietly, privately. It shows itself not in victories, but in responses. Not in dominance, but in steadiness. Not in force, but in clarity. When you reach this level, something profound happens. The world stops feeling like something you must conquer and starts feeling like something you can navigate with precision. You stop reacting and start directing. You stop absorbing chaos and start creating structure. You stop grasping for control and start becoming a person others instinctively trust, respect, and follow. Because in the end, the greatest illusion of all is believing that control begins outside. It always begins within. And if you master that, you stop searching for power. You become it. If you've made it this far, something in you has already begun to shift. You've seen how control is not a performance, not a collection of tactics, not a weapon you point outward. It is an internal architecture built quietly, privately, and deliberately. The world teaches you to chase influence by accumulating more attention, more status, more dominance, more noise. But everything you've read dismantles that illusion piece by piece. Influence is not acquired, it is cultivated. And the cultivation happens inside. The truth is simple, uncomfortable, and non-negotiable. You cannot shape anything outside of you until you can shape what happens inside of you. You cannot hold ground in conflict if you cannot hold ground in your own mind. You cannot create stability for others if you collapse under your own pressure. You cannot direct a narrative if your emotions hijack you the moment something threatens your ego. Everything begins with self-command. Not the rigid, performative kind that cracks under the first sign of stress, but the quiet discipline that keeps your mind from betraying you. The clarity that lets you see through your own illusions. The steadiness that doesn't evaporate the moment someone tests your patience or questions your identity. When you understand yourself with this level of honesty, you stop chasing power and start becoming someone who naturally shapes the environment around them. People follow the person who doesn't crumble. People trust the person who doesn't panic. People respect the person who doesn't need validation to act. People lean toward the person who remains steady when everything else unravels. Not because you manipulated them, not because you outplayed them, not because you forced them, but because human nature gravitates toward stability the way gravity pulls objects toward the earth. Real control has no theatrics. Real influence has no noise. Real power has no desperation. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to perform anything. You don't need to project strength you don't have. If you understand the architecture of human nature, the frames, the vulnerabilities, the emotional asymmetries, the rhythms of reward and withdrawal, the illusions of authority, you will see that the only battleground that truly matters is the one inside your own head. Master that, and the world rearranges itself around you without force. This is the final truth behind every form of control. You cannot own anything you cannot control within yourself. But once you own yourself, nothing outside of you feels unmanageable. You become unshakable not because the world becomes easier, but because you stop collapsing every time it becomes harder. And in a world full of instability, the person who remains steady isn't just influential, they become inevitable. That is the real power, the only kind that lasts